This is a video all about replacing the steering coupling link in an SL. Now the particular SL we're going to do it on is a 113 Pagoda SL, but you may have the same issue on a 107 SL. So let me just show you what the issue is. Now as these cars get older, it is not unusual for there to be play in the steering wheel, but when I picked this car up the last time, you can see that that's an excessive amount of play, and you can also hear that there's a clicking going on. Now there is some adjustment in the steering box on the SLs, but the problem with this particular car is that the steering coupling bushes have gone. Now this is the steering coupling here. It is still available from Mercedes, and if you happen to be lucky enough to have a Pagoda, that's the part number there, 309 460 0210, and that's about £127 in the UK. Now there'll be many more people watching this and out there with cars other than a Pagoda, maybe with a 107. So this here is a steering column from the red 280 SL 107 shape that we're working on over there, and I just want to show you the steering coupling on this. Now this is half of a steering coupling link here, the other half is broken, but you can see on this SL here the actual shaft is keyed, so this only goes on one way. Okay, now don't ever try and get this back on the car with these bolts in place, because you'll see they won't go in because the bolt has to go through that gap there, and if you try and wiggle that on with the bolt in situ, the bolt will just hit this there. So the first thing to do is when you are replacing your steering coupling, you may have got it off successfully by taking these bolts out, but when it comes to putting it back on, you have to slide it on with the bolts out. Now on the Pagoda and the older Mercedes, the steering coupling links were not keyed in the same way. They have splines in there. I believe there's 36 splines, and one of the most common errors and mistakes that people make is when they take this off the car, they do not clearly mark where they've taken it off, both from the steering shaft and also from the steering box on the other end. And if you don't do that, you'll end up with a situation where your steering wheel is no longer aligned and straight when the wheels are straight, and if that happens, you'll find that the indicators don't click on and off at the right time. Now this here is a shot from inside our 450 SL parts car, and probably the rustiest SL you'll ever see, and you can see there that that is the steering coupler there. Now the first bolt has been removed so that the whole steering column could be removed. The second bolt is still in there, and I'm going to have a go at getting that second bolt off, just so I can remove that steering coupler, just to show you what's involved on a 107 SL. Now the bolts which hold the steering coupler on are hex bolts, and they are 6mm hex bolts. And before you try getting one of these bolts out, this is really important. Do not just try putting a Allen key in there or a 6mm bit before you've actually thoroughly cleaned the inside of that and made sure that the Allen key or bit that you're using is actually seated properly, because once you round that off, and it's incredibly easy to round that bolt off, but once you do that, you're making your life extremely difficult. Now, if you are unlucky enough to round off that head, which is very easily done, you might be able to bash on a 12mm socket, and I think there's a non-metric socket that fits over that slightly better, but I don't have a non-metric socket set here to test that out. But it's easiest to actually make sure that your Allen bit is in there properly to start off with. Now, the easiest way to get that coupler off is actually from underneath the car, but because I can't move this car, take the wheel off, I don't have access. So I'm going to try. I have no idea whether it's possible. I've never done it this way before. I'm just using a 6mm bit in there, and I'm going to put a 10mm span around it and see if we can actually get it off from inside the car without having to remove the steering box. So normally what you do is you remove the steering box, and then that gives you better access to the coupler, but I'm going to try and do it this way and see what happens. Well, amazingly enough, this is actually coming undone, and I've yet to see whether we can actually get this out, but I'm amazed that it's turning. So let's just take the bolt out and then see if we can actually take this out from inside the car. Be amazed if we can. Well, there you have it. That bolt came out, amazingly enough, from inside the car. I'm probably the first person in history to ever extract that bolt from inside the car and not outside the car. Now we just need to see if we can wiggle this off. If you're lucky, you'll be able to get this off just by wiggling it. In fact, this side here is splined, so whatever you do, do not take that off without first marking the position, the exact position of the bottom of this to that steering box. Otherwise your steering wheel will never align. There you go, that is the steering coupler from a 450 SL or 107 SL, which we managed to remove from inside the car without taking the steering box off or going underneath the car. And you can see that splined on one side and keyed on this side. Now, I do believe that the steering box has a special locking nut or screw in it, or hole in it, that you can put a special locking nut that basically locks the steering in the box in the forwards position to make sure that you get this exactly aligned. I'm just having a look at my silver 280 SL, which is up on the ramp, and I think that that bolt in there, which most people assume is for draining oil out or something, I believe that if you take that bolt out, you can put a special locking bolt in there which locks the steering in the forwards position, and that's how you get it perfectly aligned. I think I'm right in saying that's how you do it, and I think that that is the bolt there. If anyone knows that for certain, please do drop a comment down below. Just while I'm underneath this car, the way most people change the steering coupling is they take all the tie rod ends here together, apart, sorry, and then they undo these two bolts here and here to take the steering box off to give you better access, which is all a bit involved. So now that we know what the 107 steering coupler looks like and how to get it off, let's have a look at the 113 here and see how hard it can possibly be to change this steering coupling. Feel the steering coupling in this pagoda. We're just taking out the bolts that hold that shroud on, and then there's one nut and bolt that holds this bracket on, which we should now be able to just lift that shroud out. This little bracket, to get it off, you have to align the gap with a ridge here, and it should just slide up like so. There's a little notch here, you can't really see it, but you've got to align that gap with that notch. Once you've done that, you should be able to just pry this up. So with that shroud slid up, you can see the problem. The bushes in that steering coupling have completely gone. So let's see if we can whip that off. Of the hex bolts which hold on the coupler loosened without any problem, but to get this apart we need to take the whole steering column off, and in order to do that there are two nuts underneath the dash which we need to undo. Now on a 107 SL it's nice and easy because you just pull the instrument cluster out and you can get access to those. On the pagoda it's a little bit trickier, so what we've got is a set of ratchet spanners. In case you don't know, ratchet spanners look like this. This is a set we just bought from Toolstation for £24. Those nuts are 14mm, and the ratchet spanner basically allows us to get in there and undo that without having to swing a socket, which we can't quite get in there because of all the wires. First nut came off without any problems. Just remember there's a washer on the other side of that as well, and that was the easy one. We just have to reach in a little bit further now and see if we can undo the other one. Now, in theory, once we take these two bolts out here, we should just be able to pull the steering column off. Now the first one should actually allow us to pull the steering column off. The second one I'm going to keep on for the time being because I just want to mark where it is on the spline. You're not going to be able to take the steering column off completely because of the steering lock here, but you should have just enough movement to pull it back in order to detach it, and then slide that up the shaft slightly to get it off. Let's see if that works. Well, holy schmoly, that took some time. Once you've taken the second one of the bolts out that secures this, you can eventually wiggle this so that the ignition barrel is like that. There you can see we have finally got that coupling free there, and we should just be able to pull that bit off the end, making sure that we have marked it before we do so. Just to make our life a little bit easier, I've just loosened that off, and that allows us to separate the steering lock and take this out so that we can clearly mark the spline at the other end. To note, there's actually split pins and washers at the end of here. So I imagine in the olden days you used to be able to get just rubber bushings that would slide on there and stop that rattling like that. The ones are sealed units. Got the old one off and the other one on exactly the same spline, and all we need to do now is tap that on with the rubber mallet. It's the next day and I'm going to see if I can get this car back together. Now, I've just jacked the front of it up so I can move the wheels slightly to help me move that steering box in slightly. I've undone the bolts, which I had to do just to line it up. Now I have to line those bolts back up with the holes on the steering pump. We finally managed to line up these 3 steering box bolts here, but what somehow I've managed to do is that those wheels are just fractionally not straight. So I think we're going to have the issue where when the wheels are lined up, that steering wheel isn't completely straight. I think what we need to do is probably take the car for a little test drive first, just to see how bad it is, and then see if there's anything we can do to correct it by possibly moving the steering column out, disconnecting the spline if that's possible, and then just moving it one spline over at the bottom. Everything back together, managed to get the steering coupler on without having to undo any of the track rod ends, tie rod ends. All we had to undo was the 3 bolts that hold the steering pump. It was a bit fiddly and I wouldn't necessarily recommend doing that job, but we got there in the end, and now we're just going to go and pick up the SL 55 AMG and take a little trip down to Cornwall. That's always assuming it starts. Remember, this car started first time on the button after 1 year. Be intrigued to see if the modern Mercedes does the same thing. We've got the Pagoda back together, my very lovely friends. In fact, the friend whom I bought this car off has invited me down to Cornwall to his beautiful house. Not only has he been very kind enough to invite me down to his lovely house, but he's also agreed to cook. I'm assuming you caught those fish yourself. Oh, yeah. The only disappointing thing is that they don't have a boat, but as his lovely wife once told me, if it flies, floats, or the other F word,
fornicates,
rent it.